Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing Högtid by Agusa.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So getting inside of this album, there are multiple favorite bits that I really loved from it. So when you're gonna see the names, they're gonna be in Swedish, but do not be afraid because I will translate them as this video goes along. But anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So as I said, today we're going to be looking at the Swedish band Agusa. They formed back in 2013 and they released this debut album of theirs in 2014. Now over on the Prog archives, this album is categorized as space rock / psychedelic rock, and I know that it kinda fits, but I think it could be described much better in another classification. So at first I felt like this album might be better categorized as folk prog or even krautrock, and I think this would fit sorta well, but then it hit me, there's a better way of describing it. But then it hit me, there's a better subgenre to fit it. This album, in my opinion, should actually be categorized as retro prog. Now, retro prog is not a categorization that the Prog archives actually use, but I think they really should, so you should implement it quite soon, Prog archives, you hear me? But basically what it means, it's like what neo-prog should have been, and it's basically a recreation of the early 70s progressive sound. Now, if I were given this album without further context, without when it came out or who was playing on it, I would immediately say without hesitation that this album came from the early 70s because it has this really psychedelic signature sound to it. It is basically led by the Hammond organ and honestly sounds a lot like early Pink Floyd, and other proto-prog bands. But as we all know, this album was not released back in the 70s, it was released a mere 9 years ago, and despite being so new, it has managed to recreate the progressive sound of the early 70s almost down to the T. And this album really features the entire four-man ensemble in the spotlight, and I think they're all doing a fantastic job, but if there's one person that really shines through the rest, it has to be Jonas Bergen with his Hammond organ. Now, what is this album actually like? Well, I'll elaborate it in just a second, but firstly I'll give a pass to anyone who's watching this video and hasn't given this album a listen yet. I'll give you a pass. Just, pause the video, heck, just close the tab, stop watching this video, go ahead, listen to the album. Just trust me, it's a better way of using your time. Because this album in particular is just a fantastic ride from start to finish. So the first track which opens this album is called In Our Garden. Of course, I'm translating the names of the tracks because I do not know Swedish, but Google Translate does. Now that track is actually so perfect that I could literally have stopped it at any given point along the track and call that point one of my favorite bits. And I cannot entirely describe to you why I like this track so much, but I just really do. It's really everything that I like about prog, although it is kind of different from what I usually listen to. And if you know this track and you know this album, you probably know why I think it is so good. The second out of the 4 tracks is Melody from Saint Knut. Now that track is really lovely. I didn't know if it was as perfect as the first one, and then the guitar solo at the end came up and I knew that I was hooked. It features a really change of pace from the first track, and it's a lot more cheery and a lot more fun and really reminds me of some sort of musical rebirth. And honestly, this entire track just kind of screams one thing to me, and that spring has come, let's snort some poppies and fucking rock. And then we reach the second side of this album, in which we are introduced to the third track being East of Sun, West of Moon. And this track is where I came to the conclusion, the obvious unavoidable conclusion, that at one point in my life I'd have to listen to this album while being high. But honestly, I think this is my second favorite track from this album, coming after the first track. This one is really kind of space rock and psychedelic, but instead of being very long and drawn out, it really is very fast paced and very fun, yet still remaining very spacey and having a very strong sense of ambience. And then this album closes with the last track called A Path in the Forest. Now that track in particular is kind of odd because it has some vocals at the beginning, but they do not last long, and that's good for this album because honestly I think that as an instrumental piece it works much better. This one has some really krautrockish influences and also has some hints of Camel inside of it, which I really liked, and honestly, might it still be my least favorite track from this album, it still is quite perfect. Now this album, much like yesterday's album, really took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting such a great album, and I wasn't expecting 2 albums which are so great consecutively, so yeah, it is what it is. But as I said yesterday, is it perfect? I'm not quite sure. Let's firstly take a look at the cover and then we'll talk about it. So you know, when seeing this album cover at first, I was like, what the hell is even that? But upon a closer inspection, my opinion of the cover kind of morphed. So back when I was young, I used to play a game called Samorost. Now it's a video game and I liked it very much, and a few years ago they released the 3rd installment of that video game, and that one has this really lovely red planet. I'm gonna show an image of it on the screen right now, and this imagery really reminded me of this cover. Well, I guess you'd say it's the other way around. This cover really reminded me of that imagery. And this cover is really compositionally quite cool. It has this sort of border which really reminds me of lark's tongues in aspic. It also has a framing which is really Arabic in its nature, and it goes on this range from beige to Bordeaux in the colors. Now, I don't know if personally I really like this cover, but I think it's kind of cool in the way that it is laid out. I kind of had a problem initially in seeing that there's a man playing the sitar when there's no sitar in this entire album, but at the same time no one's playing a cat, butterflies or spaceship on here, so I guess it's kind of justifiable. And you know, usually on this list I talk a lot about the cover matching the music of the album, and most albums, you know, they have a pretty matching cover, maybe more, maybe less, but I don't see a lot of albums and album covers which have a perfect match, and this one to me at least feels pretty much perfect. The cover looks like the music, and this is a definitive achievement for this album because honestly, as I see it, the cover itself is a way that the band represents and shows appreciation to their own musical work, and this one really does things right. So yeah, this is a fantastic cover, at least objectively, of Högtid by Agusa. So when it comes to the rating of this album, I kinda didn't know, and because I didn't know, I actually gave this album another listening while writing the script for this video. And you know, this has been my 4th listening of this album, and I think this time I will come to a different conclusion than what I did with yesterday's album, and unlike that one which received a 9 out of 10, this album is really good, and thus it will receive the prestigious 10 out of 10 rating. Now, the reason I was doubting about it is because this is not my usual cup of prog. This is not the whimsical, fast-paced prog that I usually like listening to, but again, I loved it for an unexplainable reason, and thus I'll just have to come to some sort of conclusion with myself and say that this one is pretty perfect. So welcome very much, Högtid. You are the 4th perfect album on this list. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Air Conditioning by the band Curved Air. I would like to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you very much to Clay Walnum and Brian for supporting. You guys are the best. And if any of you want to support this series, you can always check out the link in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.